To tackle all this and more, allow me to introduce Joe Kernen, co-host of Squawk Box on CNBC, to lead this discussion with our panelists, who he will introduce.
Too bad. Thank you. Right. Great. Hello. Let's get some more people in here quickly. We will. I would like to thank the Nixon Foundation for inviting me to this great event and take great pleasure in introducing my two esteemed panelists, my good friend and frequent guest on Squawk Box, Congressman Khanna from the 17th Congressional District of the great state of California, who told me that the 49ers were a lock versus the Browns last Sunday. And I bet the house. Thanks, Ro. And Elbridge Colby, co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, who also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Planning in the Trump administration. And our topic specifically is protectionism in grand strategy. It relates to many things that President Nixon felt very deeply about. It influences and determines our ability to maintain our standing in the world as the preeminent economic and military power. And in his words, and I may have heard this last night, Katie may have mentioned it, but you can't say it too many times, economic power not only enables us to maintain the levels of military power that we need, by itself it's a powerful weapon that used skillfully can advance our interest. It brings prosperity, not destruction. And we should stop being apologetic about having it and reticent about using it. And how many more examples do we need than what's happened in recent days? So protectionism can take many forms. We're going to talk about some of them. There's been a lot of discussion on both sides of the aisle about the negative impacts that protectionism can have on free trade. But we do perhaps need it to combat China's growing industrial base. And President Trump put in tariffs and duties, something that is usually loathed to Republicans. Was this a good idea, Ro, in your view?
Well, first of all, Joe, thank you for doing this. Good to be here. I couldn't have predicted the missed field goal, but my wife was happy with being a Cleveland Brown fan.
I thought it was a lock.
And Colby, thank you for all your insight. I supported the tariffs targeted on China, so I want to answer your question. But I think we have to look at this more broadly. China has a massive trade deficit with the United States, surplus. We have the trade deficit. They've got a surplus with Japan. They've got a surplus with Korea. They've got a surplus with India. How did we let this happen? How did we allow them to accumulate all of this surplus cash, which then they use to advance their foreign policy interest by creating vassal states around the world? They're using our financing to do that. I mean, we went from being the largest exporter of steel to the largest importer of steel. 9 out of the 15 top steel companies are in China. We don't have a single one. So I believe that we need to couple strategic tariffs with the financing that Hamilton had, that FDR had to build modern industries back here in the United States, including modern steel, and that we need to have an explicit goal of reducing the trade deficit and rebalancing our economy. Tariffs are one tool to do that.
I usually have a mic right here. I got to remember this. If I was interviewing you, I keep getting confused. I do. I keep getting confused. Now I only have to remember myself. Okay. Bridge, historically, Republicans, as I said, have been loath to levy tariffs, and there's a lot of grousing that Trump wasn't a true Republican. And we don't like it. We chafe as a country when we're subject to duties and tariffs from even our friends as well as our enemies. But do you think in this case with steel dumping from China or Korea, or we've even had problems with, was it milk with Canada or something? I mean, do you think there is a time and place for it?
Absolutely, and it's an honor to be on here with you, Joe, and Congressman Khanna. I actually pretty much agree with everything he said. Look, I think there's a question about are industrial policy and tariffs better in the abstract? Well, that's one question, but there's another question when is industrial policy, tariffs, and so forth necessary when you have the first peer economy to emerge in 150 years, substantially on the back of our financing, as the congressman just said, is itself using distortionary moves and so forth. It's one thing if it's a relative, say Taiwan or South Korea. I'm not saying it's okay in that context. It's an entirely different matter when it's a peer economy that is also coupling that with geopolitical and military moves. I would just say, Joe, I don't think it's actually fair to say that Republicans historically have been against the tariffs. In fact, historically, I think Republicans were often strongly in favor of the tariffs and industrial policy. You go back, as Congressman Khanna wrote, I think in Foreign Affairs, the Hamiltonian tradition that in a lot of ways the Republicans, at least in part, are heirs to. And I know President Reagan, I'm sure President Nixon also used these kind of measures. I mean, I think the successful policy that we pursued during the Cold War was a more measured form of free trade, where we were also looking to have balanced trade and balanced accounts and being conscious of how others were using, especially as they recovered. I think the error, which President Trump rightly and people like Bob Lighthizer rightly put their finger on, was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we kind of went willy-nilly in the free trade and liberalization direction without any sense that there was going to be some kind of counter move by others to balance that out. I mean, in the sense that I think people often point out that China, there was a failure of U.S. policy on China after the end of the Cold War in the sense that it didn't liberalize. I think that's partially true. But the more profound failure of our policy was that even if China didn't liberalize and continued these kinds of distorting economic moves and so forth, that we would still outcompete them substantially. And it's that error that's more consequential that I think we do need to rectify in the ways that the congressman was just talking about.
I mean, in a perfect world, there would be no tariffs, would there? But there's no such thing. And if Republicans aren't going to be free market, we can't count on Democrats to embrace the free market to the extent that sorry. No, but if the Republicans don't reject
well, I mean,
tariffs,
I don't think it's saying anti-free trade. It's saying we need to take account. We're not 50% of global GDP in the way that we were in 1945. We're not so far the world's largest and most advanced economy, or at least the largest economy as we were in 1991. So we need to look at and if our competitors are cheating, more than our competitors, our fundamental rivals, if not our opponents and enemies, are cheating on a grand scale, including in ways that involve an unprecedented military buildup. The congressman mentioned steel companies. Well, the Office of Naval Intelligence just reported that China has, I believe, 200 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. That was not a coincidence, as the Marxists say.
and I probably should have thank you, Ro, for coming here and being here. And you come on my show all the time, so you're okay. You're very confident. You're very confident. But this is.
I thought civil discourse and agreement used to be the core
it is.
of American traditions.
Right. But you're the only Democrat in the place, I think, aren't you?
I mean, I think that's sad. I think that the commentary in our country where we can't go into a forum where people may disagree or have a different ideology and win or present the force of argument. That's part of what's tearing this country apart.
We have some problems with tribalism. You do see that. It's rough. It's tough out there. You must get it all the time. And you're from, you're close to San Francisco too, right?
Silicon Valley. Valley.
All right. So they asked me to mention, is the steel low grade that we've gotten, Bridge, from China? Are we worried about national security from the quality of the steel?
Well, I don't know about the quality of the steel that we're getting from China, but the fact that we appear to be dependent on China for important components for some of our weapons systems, including I think they had to suspend F-35 production for at least a little while because some of the components were sourced from China. I think this shows the fundamental. I mean, look, I think what we're seeing. I mean, to connect it to the national security context for a second, what we're seeing very tragically in the case of the Ukraine war is that even with all of the cyber capabilities, AI, space, et cetera, at the end of the day, a large war between major powers is going to tend to be a kind of an industrial and, with post-industrial elements of attrition. It's going to be a war of attrition, and when the sides are sufficiently resolute. And in that context, you need to be able to produce stuff. Yes, I mean, if you look at the conflict in Ukraine, obviously, I mean, Eric Schmidt wrote a piece in the Journal a couple months ago pointing out the use of drones, and he's a great thinker on these issues. But on the other hand, the war in Ukraine, in a lot of respects, the front lines seem like they would be recognizable to a soldier fighting on the Western Front in early 1918. Because both sides have technology, both sides have scale, et cetera. And in that case, you need to be able to produce. And what we're seeing is that we're not. We're definitely not. And one of the things that really disturbs me is this kind of blasé attitude. And I'll say the president exhibited the other night, and Secretary Yellen and others, but many leading Republicans also exhibit that. It's, the Wall Street Journal op-ed page last week said, it's a false choice to say that we need to make decisions among these theaters. I think the manifest reality is that we don't have the defense industrial base that we need. And it seems to me that that's a bipartisan area where we need to be able to produce weapons at scale, not only for our own deterrence and defense, but for that of our allies, a very close ally like Israel, but also a way to bring back the kind of jobs in the way that Congressman Khanna was talking about in his foreign affairs piece.
Congressman, has your thinking changed given how dangerous the world has become again? We know that typically the guns and butter argument, and certain members of your party think that we're still spending way too much on defense. Are you one of those people?
I am, but I think it's not how much you spend, it's what you spend it on. And we're not spending it on the right things, which is I would support a defense industrial base. I would support having more investment in long-range missiles, anti-ship, anti-air, to make sure that we are deterring an invasion of Taiwan. But on the defense industrial base, look, I had a bipartisan amendment that cleared on the National Defense Authorization that said, let's just figure out how much of our industrial base are we dependent on other countries. The Department of Defense doesn't even know it. If we're going to move up to $1 trillion defense budget, at least let's know what are we procuring in the United States, what are we procuring outside. And we don't track that. We don't track that for the Mike Gallagher, and I had a hearing this morning on the replicator program. They don't know for that how much of the supplies are going to be procured, not just outside the United States, but in non-allied companies. So we do need to build our defense industrial base, but we also need it from a sense of pride and bringing this country together to be a manufacturing superpower. I mean, imagine, Joe, if someone came in with a platform in the 1970s, 1980s and said, you know what, we don't really need Wall Street. Let all the finance jobs go to London. Or we don't need Hollywood. Let Bollywood make all the movies. Or we don't need tech. Let some European country do tech. We would have thought they were crazy. But the tech folks, the Wall Street folks, the media folks, we kept those jobs here. And then manufacturing, we said, oh, it didn't matter. A country needs self-reliance on critical industries. And it was a colossal mistake that I think has contributed to the polarization of this country, that we hollowed out our manufacturing base. And I'm glad that we're starting now on a bipartisan basis to figure out how we get it back.
I was going to go here, but now you're where I'm going in a second, so I think we should stay with this. So we did the IRA, we did the CHIPS Act. Is that, Bridge, do you think some were bipartisan, some weren't? Is it quasi-central planning to subsidize favored industries? It's going to be expensive because things are going to cost a lot more to make here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, others are much more expert on the specifics of those legislative proposals than I. I think what I would say is, I mean, the sort of, at least in some quarters, the classic narrative that things just all completely develop organically, it does not match, I think, the history of our economic development, Germany's economic development, France's economic development, Japan and South Korea and Taiwan's economic development. It's more complicated. You don't want central planning, but the involvement of the state is an important factor.
Is it protectionism? Europe is mad, bro, that we're picking U.S. companies to do all these things, right?
Well, give me a break on Europe. First of all, we've got a trade deficit with the EU, so we don't need to be lectured from them. Secondly, they've been subsidizing their companies, and they subsidize their companies and they don't even produce winners. I mean, what's the last good tech company that Europe has produced? So I certainly don't think we need lectures from Europe on our economic policy. But, you know, here's the thing on the policy of industrialization, and this is just my theory of what happened. I mean, could be caricatured or shorthand, and feel free to push back. But if you look at the New Deal, unemployment, even under the New Deal with FDR until around 1938, was still at 18 to 19%. It only falls to 5% by 1942. And it's not just the New Deal policies, it's because then FDR goes to Ford and goes to industries, and we basically have the government financing with corporations and labor of new industry in America. With women, by the way, industrializing America. That was Rosie the Riveter at the factory. And unemployment's down to 4%. This is what leads, in my view, to the modern industrial age. The Soviets look at that and say, oh, wow, look, what the Americans did. Isn't this great? And they basically take that war economy message of central planning and take it to an excess, and they're producing, you know, tanks and war machinery without feeding their own people, without doing anything in a consumer economy. And we say this doesn't work. We are going to not have just a war economy, we're going to have a robust private sector. But because the Soviets become our contrast, we go, in my view, too far where it's just free market absolutism with no understanding that we need to make sure that critical industries stay in the United States. Trump comes along and he says, I can't get my party to go along with me. He comes and he says, you can't have a country without steel or aluminum. So if I were advising Biden, I'd say, let's do the first thing. Let's put steel and aluminum across the country, because that you're going to get bipartisan consensus. I love electric vehicles. In Warren, Ohio, hard sell. Downriver, Michigan, hard sell. I mean, just being blunt. You know, so why don't we start with the simple stuff? Modern steel mills in these places. By the way, 1/3 the CO2 emission. You could get the left and the right on board on those kind of policies.
It is going to be expensive, though, in terms of labor, in terms of everything else. And we've got an inflation problem right now. So you could convince the American public, buy American, and it's going to cost you more, and you're going to have to, you know, at the grocery store, you're going to be thinking long and hard about what you can get, but do it because we need to do it. You think we can do that?
Well, I think we can have a Buy American tax credit plan, that you get some tax credit at the end if you buy American. But more importantly, you can do modern steel factories with an investment with federal financing and the companies and labor, where you can be competitive on the price, especially with technology and with AI. And you can't do it for everything. Can you make every toy in the United States? Probably not. Can you make every piece of clothing in the United States? Probably not. But you can do it for strategic industries, and it will bring this country together. I mean, imagine if you put 3 steel plants in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, and in Michigan. I guarantee you any president who does that would have 60% approval to run for re-election.
I mean, if I could just, I think that's a very compelling argument, but if you don't find that argument compelling, I think the world crisis, I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that we're in a world crisis now. You can disagree with everything the Congressman just said and say, well, we better be able to produce our own ships. I mean, Senator Wicker, for instance, is the leading Republican on the Senate Armed Services Committee, is regularly decrying the deficits in our shipbuilding industry, as is Congressman Gallagher, as well, head of the China Committee. I mean, these are very real. We need to be able to produce more submarines, more weapons, more ships, more aircraft for peace through strength, not because we want to start wars, but we want to be able to supply our allies like Israel, like Taiwan, like Ukraine, ideally, right? So whether or not, even if you don't accept that argument, and I basically do, it seems to me it's overdetermined, and the political coalition here just seems to be so compelling. And this is what I guess I don't understand. I mean, I say this genuinely. If Jake Sullivan were here, I'd say the same thing. I would say, why is the president saying on 60 Minutes, we have no problem? Why aren't we saying, and why maybe leading Republican senators as well? Why aren't we saying? Because I would go a little, maybe even more specific. I think the current model of the defense industrial base is broken, and I don't think Americans are going to be prepared or support just dumping a whole bunch of extra money into the existing structure that's gone from having 30 defense primes in the 1980s to 5 now. And people say, wait, we're spending $1 trillion, to your point, Congressman, and we have these problems, we can't produce enough missiles? How is that even possible? So something is fundamentally, structurally broken that leads me to think that you could get it more kind of a left or new right sort of perspective. But at the same time, the sort of national security hawks, the people who are always saying the world is a dangerous place, okay, well, they also should see that we can't be reliant on China to produce the steel and the various, and if you get, to me, if you have the defense industrial base as the sort of, I don't know, it's kind of the load-bearing pillar, right? You're going to need to have steel production. You're going to need to have enough skilled welders that you're also going to be able to build commercial ships. You're also going to be able to, but it's not that we're going to produce 3 times the number of cars necessarily and hope to sell them. We're going to be producing more arms for peace, in my view, for ourselves and our allies, but that's also going to allow us to compete more effectively in the commercial non-military sector.
Colby, quickly on your point about the defense industrial base, the prime example that is broken is that they came to the United States Congress and said we need to supply more artillery to Ukraine. And I said, okay, I'd support that. Well, the only artillery we have is cluster bombs, which I didn't support with many Republicans, because we don't have enough conventional artillery. And my question was, how do you have a $1 trillion budget for defense and not make bullets? I mean, isn't that the first thing you make as in the Department of Defense? So we absolutely have an industrial-based problem.
I think, and I agree with you, and I think that's a very reasonable point of view. I mean, we might differ on where exactly the defense top line should be, but I mean, a tremendous amount of money is going into personnel. There's reasons for that with the all-volunteer force, but basically there seems to be a structure with a relatively small number of prime contractors. The subcontracting base is shriveling, really worryingly, and they're basically incentivized to do, just-in-time, small batches instead of the ability to produce large numbers of weapons and capabilities rapidly that would come from a much greater degree of scale that you're not going to get by pouring $100 billion extra dollars into the existing model.
Did you ever see yourself being from where you are saying, I think we need to make a lot more bullets in this country? Did you?
One of these clips is
are you
gonna go
thinking?
viral.
Are you thinking this through? You are really an enigma wrapped in a riddle, I think. Bro, whenever you're on, Congressman, on Squawk Box, it's almost always about China. Have you thought about that? It's almost always. That's a good point. Yeah. It's almost always about China.
Well, they got to find something we agree on.
But and we have Bridge here, but it's multifaceted discussion. But we're always talking about if it's not intellectual property theft, it's privacy, or it's TikTok. It's all these things. Is this a form of us using protectionism, or is our, and I'm sure Bridge thinks there are real concerns. If 10 years from now we're still number one, would it surprise you, or are we going to have to take some really hard steps to deal with China and the rise of China? I don't know who wants to go first.
Look, we have a lot of advantages as the United States. I mean, we have an open society which leads to creativity and innovation in a way that I don't think China's society has the same openness. We have incredible research happening here. We have the best and brightest coming from around the world, which makes us a non-homogeneous society. The fact that we still have capital financing going to entrepreneurs is an advantage. But one of our biggest advantages is that we're not complacent. And it would be a gross error to be complacent either to the threat that China poses in the Pacific and what they want to do in dominating the South China Sea, what they want to do in terms of potentially invading Taiwan, but also the other islands in that area, what they want to do on the Indian border with Ladakh and the Usk-Kim-Chin region. We should absolutely not underestimate that, and we should not underestimate their resolve to become the global economic leader in the world. Now, their model is wrong in my view because they have no market test, because they have just pure government financing of these industries that can lead to corruption and inefficiencies. Our model, in my view, is the best one, which has a robust free enterprise economy with immigration, with the rule of law, but it needs to have also strategic direction from the Congress and the government. If America is not number one, there's only one class of people to blame, the governing class of this country, the politicians. It's not the entrepreneurs or the innovators or even the universities. And I'll say one final thing about this. You know, when people talk about the gerontocracy, I said, you know what they're really angry about? And I'll just be blunt. It's not like this past generation of politicians have been our greatest generation. It's not like we're talking about people who scaled the cliffs of Normandy.
Right.
I mean, over the last 40 years, we've presided over the hollowing out of the middle class, hollowing out of the working class. We've got the most polarized country we've had in the last 40 years. That's what people are upset.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Honestly, I don't know how old you are, Congressman, but I'm in my 40s. You know, if it were more debate, and I find a lot of Democrats or other people along the spectrum, if we were having these kind of debates, I think it could be a lot more constructive. And I agree with you about the jury. I mean, if you look, I'm not the biggest Bill Clinton fan, but you have to say at the end of his administration, the United States, and partially I think a lot of credit to Congressman Gingrich and others, but you have to say we had a nearly balanced budget. We were unparalleled military and geopolitical power. Crime was at all times low. I mean, so there was a lot of social stability, I think you could say, in this country. And China was a distant prospect, a potential threat. And you look 25 years later, and things are really grim. I mean, the financial crisis, 2 failed wars, crime is up, a lot of social discord, and now we're worried about losing a war with China. So, I mean, why are we assuming, and a gerontocracy, people used to accuse the Soviet Union, but we look at our own, leadership class, and it's pretty old. And I think a big part of the problem, and to connect to a point that you made, Congressman, is I don't think they take China seriously enough. I think, the way I think about it is a lot of those people probably think the Chinese are still riding around in mouse suits on bicycles in Beijing, and that just ain't the case. That's not what it's, I mean, it's what, you got to give the Chinese their due. I always say to the Chinese when I have the opportunity to interact with them, I'm worried about you not because I hate you or something, it's because I have so much respect for what you've done. I don't approve of your model, but it's extraordinary what the Chinese people have done in turning 40 years, 50 years from abject poverty, the Cultural Revolution, to the frontier of human development. And we need to take that extremely seriously. And so sometimes people accuse me of being declinist because I say we shouldn't take our leadership role or our preeminent role in the global sort of arena and economy for granted. And I say, well, the real kind of declinism is to be blasé and sanguine, whether you're Democrat or Republican. And I think there's a lot of that. And that's what I want to touch on something, Joe, that you mentioned, which is, and it gets to the issue of protectionism, is why do we care about Taiwan and why do we care about Asia? Because I think what the Chinese, and this makes sense for them, and I'll be kind of telegraphic about it, but happy to go into it, is I think what China wants is a secure geoeconomic sphere. The fundamental stakes of what's going on with China are money. Money is what's ultimately about, because what they want and what they fear from us is the interruption of their future trajectory as a growing economy, because scale is what matters. If you look at what Eric Schmidt and Bob Work said in the AI Commission, scale matters as much in AI as it does in steel, and you got to have scale. And the incentives of a rising superpower are to make sure they have a guaranteed sphere to sell into and to buy from, and then you orient the world around you. And that's essentially commercially, and that leads you to have the best universities, and that means that creators will go there. That means the best, the future Hollywood, the future social media companies, even if we have advantages, because if we're just 20% or less of the global economy, we won't have the scale. And if China's dominant over 50% of the global economy, the future of the world is in Asia, then you're going to see protectionism. They're going to basically condition our company's entry into that market on compliant behavior. And so if you say something wrong on social media, it might be Xinjiang right now, but their criteria are going to escalate because that's human nature and that's how power works. And so that's why we can't allow China to dominate Asia. And if we allow Taiwan to fall, Beijing's going to make a big step forward. So the stakes here are economic, even though what's going to determine that is the military balance in the region.
Bridge, I was going to plug your book, too, from a couple of years ago, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict.
Good book.
Thank you.
It is good. He brought me a copy, which I'm looking forward to reading all of it. And I'm not picking on you, Ro, because both parties spend a lot of money, but Bridge, for our ability to do what we need to do economically and militarily to face China over the next 10 years, we've got 33 trillion in debt, and we've got interest rates. I think the 10-year was just under 5%. Mortgage rates are now 8%. In a couple of years, just paying interest is going to be bigger than what we spend on defense. I mean, how are you, and like I said, I'm not picking on you, but you guys have spent a lot of money. You doubled the deficit from where it should have been, even without the pandemic, right? You still blaming the Trump tax cuts, or?
Well, that did add to the deficit. But look,
Well, those are good things.
Here we have a ideological difference. I'll just tell you where I'm coming from. You know, the biggest place, in my view, that added to the deficits were one, I supported the initial strikes into Afghanistan, but staying there for 20 years, getting into Iraq, having a foreign policy that was not focused on our national interest, but got us overextended around the world. Right. Then you had the massive deregulation of the financial industry that led in part to the financial crisis of 2008. That contributed. And then we, in my view, I disagreed with the Bush and Trump tax cuts to the very wealthy. And if you reversed a lot of that, you'd be in a situation of much less deficit spending. And my view, though, where we could agree is spending that is productive, where there you have a rate of return on economic growth, is different than spending that's not productive. Now, Democrats love to call everything productive.
Do you think a corporate tax cut is a tax cut for the wealthy because corporations are? When I hear that, I always kind of that makes me chafe. So the corporations are. Don't you think we should have a low corporate tax rate to compete globally?
I think there are ways. I think that the benefits of that tax cut went to people who already are doing very, very well. I think that's where we just disagree, and I would have rather put that investment in building our industrial base. But whether we agree or not on the Trump tax cut, I voted against it, so obviously I'm on record disagreeing with it. But the point is that there are places where we can talk about productive investment in building the industrial base, in building our manufacturing base, where we can start to find some common ground in a Congress that is divided on tax policy and healthcare policy and many other issues.
I guess, Bridget, I was asking the question just because I'm not optimistic about our ability to do all the things we need to do from where we are without growth, without more tax cuts. No, go ahead.
I mean, I would not presume to comment on the tax cuts and the rate of return. I mean, there are others who are far more sophisticated and qualified. But what I would agree on is that we definitely blew a lot of money unnecessarily and political capital also in the country in terms of the failed wars and a lot of wasted things and so forth. And then we're paying for that. And regardless, there's been a ton put out in COVID, and for instance, leaving aside the merits of it, I think the implication is that we need to pursue the kind of foreign policy and defense policy in particular that the Congressman's talking about, which is more focused on our national interests, is selective and oriented specifically on the things that we need to do. And this is the main message. I mean, I would say my two big messages are focus on China, prepare for war in order to deter it. That's the best way to get to stability. And 3, focus and be selective, because I think regardless of what happens now, we are definitely so much in debt and the deficit is so high that we're not going to be able, and we were talking about President Reagan, and I'm a big fan of President Reagan, but this is not 1981. We do not have the macroeconomic picture. We do not have the workforce picture that we had then. It's very different. And there, I was struck, the Wall Street Journal, and I published there, and I agree with them often, but they said in their opinion page last week, it's a false choice between, Asia and Europe and the Middle East, and it's like, well, wait a minute. The same page put out something by Glenn Hubbard, who was President Bush's, I think, counsel.
He was on a train with me yesterday.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know him personally, but he wrote a very important piece last year saying that we need to increase defense spending, but we could not do so either by raising taxes or by borrowing more. Because and again, I'm not an economist, but I'm saying I think politically, and I would with some presumption, given there's a member of Congress here, but my sense is a lot of the unhappiness, including among some of the new right populist members on the Republican Party, is spending is way out of control. And I think that's a reasonable point. And a lot of the chaos, quote unquote, that's happening is people saying, look, if we continue in this direction, we're just pouring tons of money in the current sort of broken system. So let's be more intentional in our foreign policy. Let's be more intentional in how we spend money, and so we can get ourselves back on track. But this notion that we can just double defense spending to be 6-7% of GDP, I see zero evidence in this country that people are interested in doubling defense spending like that, especially when they look at the Defense Department and they say, I'm spending $1 trillion and they can't produce artillery shells. Meanwhile, we mock the North Koreans. The North Koreans can produce artillery shells. They have 1 million people enslaved, working in artillery factories. But who are we to criticize when we blow all this money on this defense structure that basically doesn't do a good job at efficiently producing results?
You're also going to, I agree with a lot of that. You're also going to have a situation, I'm going to be voting for the supplemental that the president's going to bring to Congress. which is to stand with Ukraine and stand with Israel in their self-defense. But you're going to have, I guarantee you, at my town halls, people will come up and say, you've just spent $100 billion or so on supporting our allies. What are we doing back home on building our industry back home? And with $100 billion, that's more than the entire CHIPS Act. You could probably have a Steel Act. You could have an Aluminum Act. So I do think that the question is, why is some of our spending not geared towards explicitly the working and middle class in places that have been hollowed out? You go to, I mean, I'm sure many of you have been there. Go to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Go to Downriver, Michigan. Go to Warren, Ohio. And for 40 years, they haven't had much economic opportunity. And I do think we have an obligation, Democrats and Republicans, to figure out what we're going to do in those places, and not everyone there is going to go become an IT tech coder.
Describing, I mean, we are not ever going to completely reverse globalization, but we're certainly comfortable reining it in to some extent. I want to just shift gears quickly. Are you in favor of this nearshoring initiative in Latin America? It's fascinating to me. They're our friends. They're in the same time zone. They all want to come here, so we have do you believe, is our southern border secure, Ro? Or you want, is that?
Well, we need to do more to secure it.
I just wonder, because I hear that all the time, that it is from some of your colleagues. But okay, let's just admit in a bipartisan way that we could do more at the southern border.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think anyone can look at it and not say
well,
that.
if we were, does it make sense to nearshore with our friends in Latin America and actually, you know the bill I'm talking about. Would you vote for that?
I'd strongly consider it. I mean, obviously, I want as much in the United States, but to the extent that we can have more of the industry in Mexico or in Latin America instead of China or Vietnam or Malaysia, and to the extent that that helps the economic development of those countries, that's a good thing. I don't think that's enough to solve the immediate crisis on the border, and you know, I don't think we're going to solve that here. But just a lot of times politicians, they say, okay, let's have long-term economic growth. Yeah, okay, if I could wave a wand and have political stability and long-term economic growth in those countries, that would be the solution. But what about right now? We do need some compromise with border security and the processing of immigration, which has eluded this Congress for past 35 years.
Bridge, when we were talking about things we were going to touch on, one of the individuals with the foundation told me, since it's a grand strategy, we like to go out 10, 15, 20 years to talk about where we're going to be. And I was like, wow, it's really hard, I think. But they were serious, and it is grand strategy. So who will India be our trading partner, a bigger trading partner with billions of people and a vibrant economy? If they stay, they can walk that line and stay a democracy, a Western-style democracy. Will they replace China, in your view, or could they?
Well, I think on the globalization note, I don't think you're going to see a full reversal of globalization, but you're going to see, I mean, in a sense, what we're seeing is that geopolitics is going to be upstream of economics on key things, not in every respect. But, you know, you're not going to trade too extensively on crucial things with a country that is actively preparing to start a war with you, right? I mean, that's sort of common sense, but we lost the thread on that. I mean, I was struck, actually, it's not a situation to make light of, but, you know, Thomas Friedman, the infamous, I think now, you know, countries with McDonald's never fight each other. Well, the McDonald's in Israel was you know, releasing statements in favor of the IDF, and the McDonald's in Oman was releasing statements in favor of Hamas or Gaza. And so I think that tells us, okay, that idea has been pretty substantially laid to rest. I think what you'll see is, you know, again, to go back to this kind of geoeconomic spheres, you'll see a kind of bifurcation, not a hard bifurcation is my sense. This is all dependent on us having, you know, succeeding in our goal in creating a reasonably sufficient, stable balance of power in Asia. But you'll see, you know, a China-oriented world. I mean, you can see it obviously with places like Russia and Iran, North Korea more strictly aligned. And on our side, you know, the United States, Japan, hopefully Taiwan, South Korea, you know, to some extent Europe and India. And then I think you'll see a lot of overlap, especially countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the Latin American countries trying to play both sides, and even we and ourselves and our allies still trading with China and so forth. I think in that context, look, if India hopefully continues to grow as it has been growing, you know, it'll become more and more an important partner. And I mean, I hear more and more optimism about India's growth prospects. I think the last 25 years, if you go back and you look at the projections about India overtaking China, in the 2000s, they didn't age out very well. But I mean, there's obviously a very large population, an increasingly educated population. The Indian government, depending on what you say, and I think their foreign policy and defense policy are excellent. But on the economic side, I'm not as expert. But if they can resolve some of maybe the structural inhibitions to growth, that should be positive. But I think China and the United States will remain in power terms, barring some really sharp shifts, the two primary actors. The basic way I think about it is the world's going to be largely bipolar in the coming generation, with multipolar features, India being, Japan being the kind of bigger second-tier players, but India and China are going to be the big poles because of their economic heft, ultimately.
And Ro, you were talking about the hollowing out that we've seen. I think you were blaming me and the boomers for not, you think the millennials are showing us leading by example, living in their parents' basement? I mean, is that really what do you think that's what we?
There is a Gen X that just gets.
They're coming around. I think Gen X. I think my dad. Blake, are you Gen? I think you're Gen X, right? Oh, sorry. Oh, you're Z. That's what I mean. Yeah, Z. That's a Brad Pitt zombie movie. So I guess my question is, you I think, see a domestic renaissance at the expense of maybe globalization. Do you want to do it that way? Is that possible to do it that way? And are you since we're talking about protectionism, aren't you seeing a world in the future to address some of your concerns that means we're going to be protectionists and making everything here?
Well, let's see how, what was the hope of globalization? The hope of the globalization was that countries like China would make sure that they didn't have the poverty that they did, that people would grow to the middle class, and that they would embrace liberal democracy, and that you would have cohesive multiracial, multicultural democracy here and engaging with democracies around the world. It just didn't work out, right? I mean, they had extraordinary economic growth. It's not that all of globalization is bad. The fact that there are hundreds of millions of people in China or India that aren't in abject poverty is objectively a good thing if you believe in the dignity of human beings. But the globalization unchecked came at a huge cost. It came at the cost of Brexit in Britain. It came at the cost of, in my view, anti-immigrant sentiment in Europe. It came at the cost of a very polarized politics in the United States. And we're no closer. It's not like we have better relations today with China or those countries. So we need to, at the very least, rebalance globalization to make sure that countries don't lose their self-reliance, that we don't forfeit entire sectors of the economy, that we care about geography and pay attention to what's going on, not just in New York or Silicon Valley, but in the rest of the country. To me, and I've said this publicly, I mean, people don't like it, I mean, the Trump election of 2016 should have been a wake-up call. You think Tim Cook was thinking in my district what's happening in Youngstown, Ohio, when he was flying around? I mean, I love Tim Cook, but people were oblivious and whatever. I obviously opposed Trump. I voted for his impeachment, but it should have woken us up that something is not right in this country. And until we address that and rebalance globalization, we have no hope of trying to bring this country together.
Bridge, we talked before that, and I said, what do you think President Nixon, how would he view China? I mean, one of his lasting legacies, obviously, is opening China, and you said he did weigh in on that to some extent before.
Yeah, he did, and I mean, just if I could comment on what the congressman said,
Sure.
And I obviously have a different view on the political issues and personalities and so forth, but I would just laud that spirit, which is, I mean, I think especially in democracy, and I'm not elected member of Congress or anything, but it seems to me the democratic spirit is to hear and internalize this kind of, enduring thing. I mean, like, for instance, just to take the Ukraine aid, I mean, I have my own views on it, but clearly, I mean, what you said about the people in your district, I hear that a lot from other Republican members as well. Okay, so is that just something to be marginalized and eliminated and treated as some kind of, anathema? Or is that something to be engaged with? Like, if I were trying to make the case for sustained Ukraine aid, I personally do believe that we should support Ukraine at a lower level, consistent with prioritizing China and our closer ally Israel. But it seems like there is a sort of an enduring and significant input that's coming from the populace that should be reckoned with somehow. And that's something, and in the same way with deglobalization, not to say that everything is materialism and it's just about money, but people feel, and the fact, that people are still supporting not only President Trump, but other candidates in the Republican primary who do not want to go back to the sort of, neoclassical economics and deregulate everything. I mean, that suggests to me, that if we're going to be a successful country in the future from an internal point of view, but also from our ability to project power and confidence and have economic growth, those things need to be reckoned with. And I commend that spirit, Congressman, not that you need to hear it from me. On the question of China, my view basically is that the opening to China made a great deal of sense at the time, because it was a way to divide the communist bloc, or exploit, more appropriately, a division that already existed in the communist bloc. And so President Nixon in particular, whose idea it was, and Henry Kissinger, I believe, admitted that last year in the conference here, he wrote about it in his famous 1967 Foreign Affairs article. Obviously, Secretary Kissinger deserves a great deal of credit for it as well. But that it had run its course by the end of the Cold War, because the purpose was to exploit the divide in the communist bloc to cause trouble, in particular for the Soviet Union. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we should have reassessed. And instead, the opening to China took on a kind of life of its own. It got taken over by this sort of, we're going to transform them into a liberal democracy, and and to some extent, the China hands, not to personalize it. But actually, I was telling Joe, my understanding is that President Nixon, before he died in 1994, had actually talked about, or written even about, reassessing it, as people like Ed Luttwak had recommended, to say, look, there's a new geopolitical context. And I'm not saying that, we needed to do, I think the vote in the Senate for most favored nation status for China was something like 100-0, or the permanent normal trade. It was overwhelming. So it's like, it's pretty strong Monday morning quarterbacking to say that we were completely stupid not to see that. I think it was a reasonable approach in the 1990s to say, we're going to try this out. And if you go back and you read Clyde Prestowitz's book, and Clyde, people like him, and Michael Lind, Bob Lighthizer, deserve a lot of credit for being right when I think most of the rest of us were off about this. But the Clinton administration had committed to holding China to account, and that didn't happen. So to me, the question is, when did you get off the China train in terms of this, pursuing this policy? We're hoping they're going to change, and if they don't change, we're still going to outcompete them. And at some point in the 2000s or early 2010s, it should have become more apparent, certainly by the mid-2010s, very apparent that things were not going in a healthy direction, and we need to fundamentally reassess. But President Nixon, as a great geopolitician, was very prescient on that issue.
It's a difficult thing, to consider. It's hard to pass up 1.5 billion consumers. And I see it every day with Disney and Nike and Apple, and we tell, I guess China hawks say, just be prepared to just cut everything off completely when they take Taiwan. It's a weird position to be basically all in. Starbucks, my own company, Comcast, we have a lot of operations there. How do you walk that line with China? What would you tell CEOs to do right now?
Well, I am not for a complete severing of the economic relationship. I am for the rebalancing of the relationship. I've said this even in the context of the co-chair of the U.S.-India caucus. I think we have to make sure that as we develop that relationship, we don't have structural trade deficits. And it's not, to me, an unreasonable thing to say to China that you've got to open more of your markets towards American goods that are made here, not the high technology, sensitive technology goods, but towards things that we can export. And you've got to stop dumping your things in the United States, and we're going to be more self-reliant. And we want to get that trade deficit to be lower, because we're no longer going to be financing you to go give loans all over Africa and all over the world and help you build your power. that seems to me a reasonable thing. Now, I think that's for Congress to do. If you're a CEO, you have a duty to your shareholders, you have a duty to profit maximization. I don't think me lecturing them, I mean, they may give me platitudes and then they'll go and do what's in their business interest. But it's for Congress and the administration to make the rules that help us redefine industry here and rebalance the trade deficit. I believe that should be an explicit goal of foreign policy, is lowering the trade deficit with China.
Bridge, there's more NBA fans in China. There's twice as many as there are people in the United States. And you saw when it was the GM of the Houston Rockets, he barely said anything. And LeBron, and I mean, it's important. It's an important market. That's just an example. But with your worldview, how do we do this?
Well, I actually think my worldview is more consistent with that reality. I agree with what the Congressman said. It's up to the government, and we don't need full-scale decoupling. We can have degrees of exposure. This is because, and this is why some people think I'm sort of old-fashioned, but I tend to really focus on the military balance. And the reason is because economic leverage and economic sanctions, and I don't know what was said, I wasn't able to make it because I had another commitment, but economic sanctions don't work very well. I mean, it's shocking how poorly they're working against Russia. Certainly they're not just convincing Putin and the Kremlin to behave differently, but the Russians are actually selling above the price cap. But let alone, leave Russia aside, look at Cuba, look at North Korea, look at our efforts on Iran and Iraq. Economic sanctions don't work very well. They certainly don't work to precipitate major changes in the targeted state's behavior. So that's bad in a lot of contexts for us, but it's also good because it also is true for China. Because it means that if we're trading with China, and China one day says to the NBA, oh, we're going to cut you off, and the NBA comes and whines to the White House and Congress, some members are going to say, oh, I'm sympathetic, but probably they're going to say, go break rocks or something. That's your problem. You took that risk. What matters is military force. If you really want to force somebody to do something they don't want to do, you invade their country and you put a gun in their face. And that's what, I think unwisely we did in the case of Iraq. That's what China's thinking about doing with Taiwan. What that means, though, paradoxically, is I tend to be rather dovish on economic measures. A, because I don't think they work very well, and I would rather spend that political capital on the military side. And B, we might actually even be counterproductive. I am concerned that we have a variant of the Japan 1941 scenario, and my friend Neil Ferguson, I think, has referred to this in his Bloomberg column before, which is that we are convincing the other side, the targeted state, in this case China, that we are quote-unquote trying to strangle them. That is the term that Xi Jinping is using, without actually having success. So I don't think the economic sanctions are going to hold them back, but we are convincing them that we are trying to hold them down. So what I would rather do, especially in this window of vulnerability, is really focus on the military balance in the region, and I actually would throttle back. And then my advice to corporations would be, look, and I said this, I was on a commercial thing yesterday, I would say, look, it's up to you. If you think nothing is going to happen and you're taking a big risk, that's on you. If you don't want to be in the position of McDonald's, which was not subjected to sanctions in Russia, but people didn't want to support, McDonald's in Russia, there could be Americans dying directly, and that's going to be huge exposure for a company. But if you want to take a risk on something outside of civil-military fusion or things like semiconductors, I think that's on them. If you're the case of the NBA, but caveat emptor, and we will not bail them out. But I don't think we need, there are reasons for us to decouple on our own terms, as we've been talking about. But from a strategic perspective, I think the main thing is the military balance.
All right. Ro, can you see that clock? I have to do this all the time. Hit a hard break, and you got to hit it exactly. So in closing, I'd like to thank Ro. Thank you. Bridge, and I'd like to also thank the Nixon Foundation, and just leave us all with a quote that I'm sure you've all heard from President Nixon, and it was mentioned to me, Blake, by Scott, totally separately the other day in a different context, but I think it's relevant today in our politics and even more broadly. The president said, always remember that others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself. And I want you to take that back to Congress with you. Will you? And maybe that'll help. Did you remember? You want to take this with you?
I'll try. I thought you were going to announce your candidacy for speaker.
I was going to bring that up because we've thought about...
we're looking for a bibipartisan speaker, Joe.
A bipartisan? And I don't need to be a member of Congress. You're right.
You don't need to be a member of Congress.
You're right. No. No. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.